What is up YouTube, and welcome back to the channel. So before I start today's video, I just want to say a couple of things. Firstly, thank you so much to everyone who's been supporting the channel over the last few months. It's been insane to watch the growth on the channel and how much you guys have been enjoying the content. So I really hope you guys enjoyed today's video as well. And secondly, I just wanted to apologize for how late this video has gotten out. I just had a lot of things on my plate in the last couple of months and I didn't get enough time to get around to posting. So what are we going to be covering today? A lot of you guys have been asking me how are we playing Virtual World in this new format. A lot of things have changed. Virtual World isn't the top contender. That spot's probably reserved to like Sword Soul or Phantom Knights. And so there's a couple of things we have to adapt in our strategy and how we're playing the game. And that's what I'm going to be addressing today. So I'll skip through the main monster lineup in this deck profile fairly quickly because it is fairly standard. The only thing I'm not playing is the Tutu, and that's just because I needed to make space for other tech cards in the main deck, which you might have already noticed. If all of this main deck looks foreign to you, I highly recommend you go and watch my tutorial and extensive guide to Virtual World. Hopefully that explains all of the basics for you. So I'll gloss over these. Obviously the two Italian are standard extenders / consistency cards. The main difference to this deck profile in the main deck is the 3 there can be only 1. The rest is pretty standard. I'll discuss the hand trap choice in a moment. There can be is extremely powerful in this format, especially because decks like Sword Soul and Phantom Knights, which are again the top contenders, same for Invoked and Dogmatic of variants. Most of those decks are mono archetype and really struggle to get around there can be only 1 because they don't have main deck outs. Phantom Knights, they have to open multiple of the Psychic Ascenders, otherwise they're locked away from their warriors, which is the majority of their engine. Sword Soul can basically just not play the game because their entire engine is exclusively worms, and if they can't climb into some synchro whatsoever, that just dead stops their engine. Whereas for us, it's really not a big of a deal because we can keep cycling into different synchros and then opening up space for our worms and psychics. And you can also set up a pretty nasty lock, which I'll explain in a moment. Next up, let me just explain the hand trap lineup I'm choosing for the format. 3 Imperm, pretty standard I guess. Imperm is just an extremely powerful card this format, and the reason for that is because it hits pretty much every single deck in the room and it doesn't play into talents, which is quite a big deal. Hand traps are pretty strong this format. It kind of switches from format to format, but because of that, obviously talents is kind of more prevalent in some main decks, especially in like, all gas, no breaks, turbo combo decks like Lyraless Tri-Brigade. And in those cases, you really don't want your opponent to just get free extenders off like a Veiler or an Ash. And so that's why we play Imperm. Imperm can obviously hit a lot of stuff like the Mo Yi if your opponent opens a suboptimal hand, but also it's also quite nice going second as like a pseudo, kind of like Chalice, which I'll explain in a moment, where you can just hit problematic cards on your opponent's board like a Mechaba, like a DP, etc, etc. And it can also deal with the Cytlock. Next up we have the 3 Nib. I feel like Nib is borderline mandatory this format just because most of the combo decks in the format, pretty much all of them, and not only do they set up a really oppressive board, but they set up a lot of follow-up for the next turn. And if you can nib your opponent at the right moment, like for Phantom Knights when they have multiple monsters on field that will be banished when they leave the field, you can prevent both of your opponent's board from occurring, or forcing them to set up a suboptimal board, and stopping all of their follow-up from occurring, which puts you in a really good spot, because as Virtual World, you can grind out a lot of games if you get access to cards like Chuchi. So that's essentially where you play Nib. Also against the Lyrilusk matchup, it's just way too powerful if they set up their full board and have the Oath in graveyard and the Apex Avian, so you kind of just have to play the Nib. Next up we play Chalice. Chalice is like a new card I've been testing. It's really, really good actually, and the reason for that is because you can hold it in your hand, and again, kind of like Droplets, at the instant where your opponent actually uses some kind of interruption which would affect your plays, you can use that Chalice to stop the interruption, and that kind of derails your opponent's line of thought. They might have thought they could interrupt you at a certain point, but they actually can't. Chalice also has a bunch of pretty cool interactions because of its attack modulation. You can use it in the damage step, at the beginning of the damage step or before damage calculation, and your opponent cannot respond to Chalice except with card effects which will negate activation of cards. I actually have a video coming up later this month explaining some common meta rulings that a lot of people mess up, so stay tuned for that. Another cool thing about both Chalice and Imperm is obviously because they're spells, we can set them to trigger our Zorkin, and they're also really, really good to stop the Fluandery strategy, which is probably one of the scariest decks if you let them full combo. Imperm is particularly good for that. Next up, let's have a look at the extra deck. If you're sharp, you'll have noticed that we're no longer playing the Kaliga lock, and let me just explain my thought process behind that. So, a lot of decks, just like us, we're main decking like going second spell and trap board breakers, and the reason for that is because a lot of decks aren't playing any spell and trap negation. Some decks have like an omni negate, like Sword Soul can get a Baron on the field, But like Phantom Knights doesn't really put up anything. Obviously the Invoke deck, most of the time they just have a monster negate, they're not really holding spells in hand. Most of their power spells will be on field and they want to use them. And because of that, going second cards like Dark Ruler, etc, are extremely powerful in the format. And so going for the Kaliga end board, in my opinion, is very, very high risk, high reward. What I mean by that is that you're committing a lot of resource into going into that end board, and in some cases it won't actually net you much. Also, another thing to note is that in most cases, if you play your cards correctly and you set up for good follow-up, Treat Sheepless Crystal Wing actually does a lot. For example, with Sword Soul, if you get rid of their token at the right instant, and they can't climb into another synchro, that's going to hurt a lot. If they do have an extender to get access to another token, you can hold your Crystal Wing negate at the right instant to stop that. And most of the time, they won't have 3 extenders to get token access, and if they don't have token access, they can't synchro climb. The same thing applies for Phantom Knights. If you get rid of their Rusty Bardiche and they don't have any other extenders in graveyard, most of the time they won't really be able to do much other than maybe potentially go into a Break Sword, but you should have things to deal with that. And that kind of applies to the rest of the format. And remember, with Virtual World, your engine is extremely oppressive once it gets started, and so if your opponent can't really deal with your board in their own turn, you are almost 100% going to set up a lethal turn in your turn 3. What we're playing instead of Kaliga is Totem Bird. Now, I actually underrated this card for a really long time, but it's extremely easy to make with Lulu and then triggering your Neon Engrave, which is kind of a strange play you wouldn't have made before. You would have usually preferred to Synchro Climb, but Totem Bird is actually really, really strong. Sometimes you can set it up before your Zolkin if you know you're going to play into Nib anyway to protect your Zolkin from Imperm, which of course is an extremely popular hand trap in the format. And Totem Bird also protects your board from, the going second cards we just discussed, which ensures that your power cards like your Crystal Wing, or if you're ending on a Shen Shen, remain live. It also really helps in games too when your opponent is likely to be siding things like Evenly or whatever else. The rest of the extra deck is pretty standard, except for a couple cards which I'll just explain. Fan has always been in the extra deck, but it's particularly powerful now because it completely outs the entire Dragoon package. Not only does it banish the Dragoon, but you can banish the Celestial in graveyard, which prevents your opponent from getting that follow-up in their next turn. And because we're playing Fan, and Fan requires you to detach 2 materials and not 1, that's why we're playing the Gaia Dragon, which wasn't previously in the extra deck. But having that access to a Zeus from every single rank 6 in your extra deck is really high value, and that's why we play it. The other card to note is Beatrice. Beatrice is an interesting tech that I've kind of been testing in Ranked, and it's actually come up a lot. And the reason why I'm playing Beatrice is for Token Collector. So you might think, why am I playing the one-off Token Collector, and why is it, just there for Sword Soul? You might think that's like over the top, but the reality is I've heard of people going to regionals and playing 6 rounds on 9 worth of Sword Soul. So you might not want to tell yourself that, but the reality is Sword Soul is an extremely powerful deck, extremely consistent, and a lot of players are choosing to play it. And because of that, you do want to have an out for it ready. And especially when you're going first, if you can maximize your probability of just outright beating this deck with unfair cards like Token Collector, like your There Can Be Only One, then that's going to put them in a really bad spot and make your life a whole lot easier. So that's why we play it. Next up for going first, we play the 3 Judgment. I don't play Anti-Spell or Imperial Order, although there are some Virtual Order lists that do play it. The only reason I do that is because we actually play quite a lot of spells, and a lot of those spells are really good spells that we really do want to draw into, and being locked out of our own engine isn't great. We can kind of function without it, but I'd rather not be limiting my own plays because of a card I choose to play. Next up, we play, Chainable Back Row Removal is an absolute must in the format. You cannot really be playing cards like Lightning Storm because most of the scary spells and traps will not really be affected by it, especially things like the Scythe Clock. Having Cosmic is huge. The Fluandre's trap is only limited to the main phase, so you can get rid of it in standby or draw phase with your Cosmic. And there's a whole load of other scenarios where Cosmic is so much bigger, even against like the Phantom Knight Fogblade traps. We play the Reboot as a one-off because it's also really nice to deal with stuff, and you can climb to a Zeus really easily to clear the entire board, so that's really nice. One-off Duster can come up, it's nice versus Sky Striker, just to clear all of their back row when it might be really oppressive. 3 Droll, this is primarily to deal with the Drytron matchup. Drytron is still a pretty prevalent deck. You can also side the Droll versus the Lyrolust deck. And both of those matchups, it's like a very combo-heavy matchup where you don't want your opponent to get more resource than you, simply because both of your boards are pretty flexible and able to regenerate. If you can put your opponent behind in resource, and you can overpower them with a really consistent, powerful engine, that puts you in a really good spot. And then the Lancia, again, for the Phantom Knight matchup, you don't really need it for the Sword Soul matchup because Protoss doesn't really do anything to you, but you can also use it in the Fluandre's matchup to essentially prevent them from regenerating their entire engine, which is really, really important for that deck. So that's it for the new list, although it's not really like new, we've just changed a couple of things up and hopefully I've explained them. Next up, I'll just show you a couple of combos displaying how the deck's changed, and I'll also kind of explain a couple of the cool lock-like things we can do with our deck to help maximize our win rate in this new format. Alright, so for the first quote-unquote new combo, I'll just be showing you what you can do in like a very basic game state, just opening Kowloon, Lulu, and then, you know, a couple discards, a couple cards to set. Again, people always comment on my videos saying, oh, this is a 4-card combo. If you play Virtual World, you'll know it really isn't. You play so many cards you can set, and your engine is like pretty damn consistent. You play a lot of draw power, so your likelihood of opening hands like these is extremely high, and the more you play the deck, the more you'll understand what I mean by this is a common hand. So we'll start off by activating our Kowloon and getting access to our Chuchi. Obviously we'll then go Lulu targeting the Chuchi. A good thing about this format is a lot of people aren't playing Ash. Some decks are. I personally don't think Ash is that great this format. Yeah, it can hit Fusion Destiny, a couple other things, but against the big scary combo decks it really does nothing, which means most of the Virtual World effects are pretty safe. Next up we will be searching with our Qinglong, and I'll just explain why we're searching early now. If our Lulu has resolved, likelihood is our opponent doesn't have an Ash, so it's pretty safe to do so. Next up, we will go Kirin targeting the Lulu and double dumping, putting follow-up with another Qinglong engrave. And then we'll immediately go and activate Chuchi to raise the level of Lulu. Now, what you'll notice at this state is that we have 2 different name Virtual World cards banished, which means our Chuchi is live. Now, a lot of players misplay and wait to use their Veiler once Zul'Kin effect has been triggered. This is incorrect and you should not do this. You should 100% shotgun Veiler or Imperm on the Zul'Kin summon. That way Zul'Kin will just not resolve that turn. If you wait till I activate Zul'Kin and I have 2 banished Virtual World cards with different names, then once Zul'Kin is activated, you can chain Veiler and I can chain Chuchi to pop the Zul'Kin, which essentially just wastes a card completely on your behalf, and I still get access to my Crystal Wing. So note to you is to absolutely shotgun the Veiler on Zul'Kin summon. Next up we'll just go Roshi, dump the Nyan Nyan, summon the Lulu, and then get access to the Nyan Nyan. The reason we do this and we don't actually play the GG in this entire combo is we actually want to end on Totem Bird, and this is basically our end board. Now you might think that's really not that much, but for a pretty simple hand that doesn't really have access to much else, this is actually really not that bad. Versus most decks going first, game 1, unless they have some cracked hand that breaks this board, this is a pretty safe board to end on. Again, you have that pop, you have the Spell Trap Negate, and you have the Chuchi, the Crystal Wing, and you have a lot of follow-up engrave because you have a Qinglong, and then you have another 2 cards in hand which you haven't used, 1 card, and that just sets you up in a really good position going into turn 3. So that's it for the first combo, and I'll just show you a couple of other ones that display the different kind of things you can do with this new style of build. Alright, so for the next quote-unquote combo, I'll just be showing you an extremely simple thing you can do with pretty much any access to a live virtual engine. That means just any name plus a target, literally anything will do, and there can be only one. And this works very, very well if you know your opponent is on decks like Phantom Knights or Sword Soul. If you're playing like a larger event, by past like rounds like 5, 6, you almost definitely know what your opponent is playing. So this combo is like quite useful to know, again, like quote-unquote combo. I just wanted to outline it because a lot of people get greedy and try to go for like the craziest thing, but a lot of the time a more conservative play might actually put you in a much better spot. And essentially what I'll be showing you is just how to always access your Geomath Mech Final Sigma. And Geomath Mech plus there can be only one is like borderline an FTK in a lot of scenarios. Again, what I'm saying might sound really obvious, but you'd be surprised how many people see a hand like this and then try and go into the Zul'Kin play. Why would you not want to do that in a later round? A lot of decks are playing a lot of hand traps. If your hand is as basic as this, and you're either getting, you know, 1 interruption off your Zul'Kin, or none if your opponent even just Veilers it because you don't have access to a Chuchi to pop your own Zul'Kin, that's really not that great. Going for a safer play like this puts you in an extremely good spot, and to be honest, this is almost impossible to out for a lot of decks. The reason for that is because Geomath Mech is unaffected by card effects, and it's a 3000 beast set. Most decks, to attempt to even try to get rid of this card, will have to climb to cards like Access Code or Boral Sword or whatever big monster they can put on board. And in 99% of cases, they're not going to be able to do that unless they get rid of There Can Be Only One. And if they need to expend resource into getting rid of your Tikaboo, and then trying to climb to something big enough to get rid of Geomath Mech, and you still have another 2 cards in your hand, which you didn't really combo with, because, you know, they might have been suboptimal, that might be like hand traps or whatever else, even like a Nibiru. Nibiru would be great here because your Geomath Mech won't get tributed because it's unaffected, but in many of those cases, you're forcing your opponent to go for a very, very suboptimal play just to get rid of 2 cards on your board, and you have a follow-up Qinglong in graveyard, and you have 2 cards in hand. So I just wanted to outline a very simple board state you can reach from pretty much any kind of access to a virtual engine, but in a lot of cases this is one of the safest places to go to, and it actually wins you a lot of games. So that's it for this combo, and let's move on to the next one. Alright, so I said I was going to do another combo, but then I figured if you guys have seen my extensive virtual world guide, go check that out if you haven't already. You should be fairly comfortable about navigating these hands, even if you aren't aware of like the new kind of end board we're going for, having seen the deck profile previously and what I discussed. So I figured it would be more useful to just do 2 test hands to display my kind of thought process, tackling the new format and trying to get the most out of our hands. So opening this hand, the first thing I see is we have Desires and Imperm and a Qinglong, which is really nice and pretty good engine. I'm immediately thinking I kind of just want to shotgun Desires instantly to see if they have an Ash and bait it out if they do. If they do Ash it, that's not really a big deal, we still end on a lot. If they don't, we get a lot more resource, and it doesn't really matter what we draw here because getting 3 discards is nice in this hand anyway. So we're going to go ahead and use that Desire straight away. As I said, Ash isn't that prevalent in this format, so sometimes your Desires will be extremely free. Go ahead and banish those 10 and draw 2. Here we draw the Desires and a Kowloon. Kowloon is great, Desires isn't. A lot of people commented on my last video saying like, oh, Desires is trash, play Prosperity. Don't play Prosperity. I really do not like Prosperity because it conflicts with a lot of the draw engine in your extra deck, and also cuts away a lot of your tech options. And trust me, especially in grindy matchups versus like Sky Striker, you will be using your extra deck a lot. The first thing you want to do before doing any plays, you want to see what you banished. Here we have a look. We banished 1 Nian and 1 Zhuangmu. That's the only substantial thing I noticed. The 1 Qinglong is pretty irrelevant because we have 1 in hand and multiple, one more in deck. Here we're going to go ahead and activate the Kowloon because I know I have an Imperm to set to trigger the Zorkin. And by activating the Kowloon to get access to our Chuchi, I know I can go for the route which plays around Nib. Here we're going to summon the Lulu, summoning the Kirin by targeting the Lulu to dump the Chuchi because I know I didn't banish both or even one. Here I can use the Chuchi to raise the level of Lulu, and then I immediately also activate Qinglong. The reason I do this is so I have 2 banished, again as I mentioned, that way our Zorkin is protected in case our opponent is stupid and doesn't want to shotgun Veiler. Here we summon the Zorkin, set our Imperm and trigger the Zorkin. Next up we're going to use the Roshi to dump a Nian Nian, and then we're going to do a pretty funky play that again might feel very strange, but we're going to summon Lulu and Nian. The one thing to bear in mind here is because we're doing this, it's actually quite important now that we actually dump a Lulu with Gigi. Why? Because the Lulu that we played is overlaid on Totem Bird, and if you want to add that Lulu back in end phase with the Gigi, you're going to need to put another one in grave. Here we're going to synchro into our Shenshin, and in end phase, of course, we get the add back of Lulu. And as you see, this is a pretty damn threatening board. This pretty much, you'd have to really open a good going second hand to stop this, because you have a Macrocosmos on field, which is basically a Paleozoic because of the Chuchi. You have a Monster Negate and a Spell Trap Negate, and we have an Imperm. The Imperm isn't like the craziest interruption, but it's very good. And in our graveyard, we have a Chuchi for next turn, and we have a Lulu, which basically means if our opponent doesn't only break our board, but set up their own good board, we're pretty much going to set up a lethal OTK next turn. So that's it for the first test hand. Let's move into number 2. Alright, so for the second test hand, again, it's a pretty obvious hand, but I just want to show you guys the kind of things you need to be thinking when you open a hand like this one, and the kind of routes you should instantly recognize are available to you. So looking at this hand, I instantly know I do have access to full combo, but it is a weak hand. The reason for that is that we can't get a Chuchi face up on field to protect our Zorkin from any eventual poorly timed Veiler or Imperm. And trust me, a lot of people do this, so if you open Kowloon, it's almost as good as your Zorkin is safe, unless you know you're playing against a good player. I also know I don't really have access to a Lulu which can target something to search another virtual world, so we're not really setting up that much. So I'm actually thinking maybe the best thing to do here is to go for a pretty safe end board and set up a decent bit of follow-up for next turn, and that's exactly what I'm going to go for. We're going to normal summon the GG, activate the Roshi. Unfortunately, we don't get to summon back anything, but we're going to send the Qinglong to search a Kirin. Here we're going to discard one of the Chuchis because we do not need both. We're going to summon the Kirin by targeting the Roshi and double dump, summoning out. Here I choose not to go for the Crystal Wing Zorkin, although I perfectly well could. The only reason for that is because if that Zorkin gets hit by pretty much anything, this end board turns into pretty much nothing. It ends up being like a Shen pass kind of end board, and I'd rather go for something safer in this hand, just again to give you an idea of the kind of things you can do. Why? Because a lot of decks can't really out Geomathemic Final Sigma, which is the card we're going to be going into. After that, we're just going to use the Zhuangwu to summon back the Roshi. kind of because we also just need 2 banished cards to make our Chuchi live, summoning the Shen Shen, setting the Chuchi, and passing turn. So we're ending with a single Qinglong and a Chuchi in grave, which makes our own Chuchi live again next turn if we need to interact with cards like, I don't know, a Mystic Mine or whatever else, because we can put another 2 cards in the banished. And of course we have our Floodgate, Macrocosmos, and our Unaffected Towers, and our Paleozoic Dynamiscus if you like. Very simple end board, very simple test hand again, but I just wanted to outline the kind of things you want to be thinking when you look at this hand and not just always be going blind for the obvious route, like you might have done last format when, you know, Crystal Caliga was a bit safer and it was a really powerful end board to go for, but now you kind of want to be thinking more conservative and again how to best deal with the format. Again, like shutting down the entirety of the Phantom Knight engine, because as soon as those cards leave the field they're banished, is pretty damn good, and a lot of the time that might be enough to push for game. You don't need to go for a risky end board which might put your opponent in an advantageous position. So that's it for today's video. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. I will have an upcoming meta rulings you need to know video, and I'll also actually have a gameplay review of my own match I played in ranked coming up pretty soon. Let me know if you guys enjoyed the DB format. I'll be recording most of my videos on DB for the upcoming month because I'll be away without access to my own cards. So let me know if you guys like this format. I just wanted to try something new. And yeah, hopefully you guys enjoyed today's video and stay tuned for the next one.